responsible gun owners support it. You know, the Brady bill has kept 2 million guns from being sold into the wrong hands. Because of that background check, despite its loopholes, prohibited purchasers because they were felons, fugitives, stalkers, domestic abusers, people with serious mental illness have been stopped from buying a gun. So as bad as the gun carnage is, I like to think that at least 2 million prohibited purchasers weren't part of that. I also think it's critically important to close those loopholes, to close the gun show loophole and the online loophole. You know, back when the Brady bill was passed in '94, online purchases were not an issue. We now know they are. So we have to go for universal background checks, and we have to close those two loopholes. And I have said that if the Congress doesn't cooperate, I would use executive action to make sure that sellers are held accountable. I also believe we should close what is now being called the Charleston loophole. Under the background checks, if someone applies to buy a gun, the seller has 3 days, those sellers that are covered, to conduct a background check. And if it is not completed by the end of 3 days, the purchaser gets to buy the gun anyway. Now, the reason it's called the Charleston loophole is that the killer of those 9 people at Bible study in Mother Emanuel Church in Charleston got his gun not because he was eligible, because in fact, it was learned shortly after he was not eligible. He had a felony record. But because of this loophole, he was able to go back at the end of 3 days and buy the gun he used to kill those 9 innocent people. And then finally, we have to repeal the broad immunity that has been given to gun manufacturers and sellers in America. And which has shielded them from any responsibility for their sale of guns and ammunition or their manufacture of either. Now, just recently, there was some small glimmer of hope when a jury in Wisconsin found a seller of guns liable because of a straw purchase, which the seller clearly knew to be a straw purchase. A straw purchase is, you're not eligible, you're a felon, you got a domestic abuse order against you, you've been committed. Remember, the shooter at Virginia Tech had been committed for outpatient treatment for mental health, still got a gun. But in this particular case in Wisconsin, the prohibited purchaser sent somebody else in with a clean record to buy the gun for him. There's video and other evidence that the seller knew that the gun was for somebody else, sold it anyway. So the seller buys it, turns it over to the real purchaser, who goes out and shoots 2 police officers, injuring both seriously. And so when the police officers sued the gun seller, the jury heard the evidence and came in with a verdict in favor of the police officers. Now, we're going to see whether or not that verdict stands up under this broad immunity that has been given to the gun industry. There's really no other industry in America that has this kind of blanket permission to be reckless, to be negligent, to sell defective products even. It's just outrageous. And we have to repeal that so that those who manufacture guns and sell them are held to some standard of accountability. So I'm going to do everything I can in this campaign to not only talk about this issue and to give the platform to people like Clay, who can be much more eloquent than I ever can about why this is an important issue. But I'm also appealing to responsible gun owners. Organize an alternative to the NRA, which is nothing but a lobby for the most absolutist positions that the gun manufacturers and sellers demand. We have so many responsible gun owners. I'm not against guns. My dad taught me to shoot when I was a little girl. I've even gone duck hunting in Arkansas, standing in the cold water at sunrise. Once was enough getting up that early to stand in that cold water, I could tell you that much. But so this is not about the kind of scare tactics that you will hear from the NRA. You know, this is what they do. They just scare responsible folks into thinking that, you know, the black helicopter is going to land in the front yard and somebody's going to show up and take your guns. That is nonsense, and it needs to be called out for what it is. But the fight against the NRA should be led by a new organization of gun owners. I'm collecting names of people who are stepping up and writing, you know, about their feelings as people who enjoy hunting, enjoy target shooting, enjoy collecting, but who are sick and tired of the violence. People who are killed and injured. So I am very grateful to my good friend, your Senator, Molly Kelly. And I am very grateful to Clay for sharing what is a very painful, personal story to try to save lives. And I really look forward to working with a groundswell of people across our country who know we can do better than this. We are better than this. So with that, let me throw this open to questions on whatever issues or concerns you might have. We have some microphones, I think. So if people raise your hands, we'll try to get to as many of you as possible. I can see there's already a lot of hands up here. Let's see. The woman in the back, because that's really close to the microphone, right there.
Hi, my name's Leslie Rule, and I actually have a question about the NSA. So we have Edward Snowden. We have Traitor on one end of the spectrum, and we have Patriot on the other end of the spectrum. And I'm wondering where you stand in that and why you stand that way. And to let you know that I consider him very close to a patriot. I think that the information that he released is something that the American people needed to know and to have publicized. So that's my question to you.
Well, let me say this. I firmly believe that he could have gone public and released the information about the collection of information on Americans under whistleblower protection. And he could have done it within the tradition in our country that shields people who come forth acting out of conscience to present information that they believe the public should have. I do not know why, in addition to releasing the information that you're referring to, he felt compelled to steal a lot of information that by any definition had nothing to do with American civil rights, liberties, and privacy, but instead were about terrorists and what other nations, just to name two, China and Russia, do to try to gather information about us and what our government tries to do to prevent that and to try to get information about them. So if he'd been a whistleblower, and if he had confined himself to releasing information that I think did provoke the right kind of discussion in our country and has led to some changes, which I approve of, then I think people could, across all spectrum, say, hey, thank you for bringing this to our attention, and thank you for giving us the opportunity to respond. Because he took valuable information and went first to China and then is now under the protection of Vladimir Putin, I think that raises a lot of questions about everything else he did. So I do not think he should escape having to return an answer for what he has done. And I think, though, we need to continue the balance on civil liberties, privacy, and security. It's always a challenge. And I do support what the Congress passed, the USA Freedom Act, because I think it did have some good changes, and I think we have to remain vigilant. But it's always a balance. It's a balance. It's not just all one-sided. You know, if you go too far towards security, you do infringe upon the legitimate rights of Americans, and that's what we're trying to end. If you go too far toward privacy and, civil liberties, you can leave us vulnerable, and we're trying to prevent that too. So that's the kind of hard choice balancing act that I think President Obama has been attempting to do, and I support the changes that he has been making from the executive level, and I support the new legislation that the Congress passed. Well, now just a minute, sir. Just a minute. I'll get to you, I promise, but I kind of like to go in a broad sweep. But okay, you've stood up. We'll hear from you. Where's a microphone that we can get to? Just a minute. I mean, it's great having people so eager.
Thank you. After the recent Oregon shootings, what President Obama said was, the hearts and prayers go out, but then he talked about gun control, but he said gun control is not enough. What we need is a culture of gun safety. And I think we need to add to what we're doing.
Well, I agree with you on that, and I like to refer to what I'm advocating as gun safety measures, and the gentleman makes a very good point. Like so many of you, I'm reading news online, and I see a headline. I think it was in the Washington Post, which said something, as I recall. Toddlers are killing more people with guns. And I stopped. I went, what? Why? Because the people whose homes they live in, mostly their parents, sometimes their grandparents, have loaded guns in their homes, in their cars. And children are curious. And they're picking up loaded guns. And I read the story after I was shocked by the headline. The toddler in the back seat where there was also a loaded gun, picking it up and looking at it and shooting his grandmother. And there was, it's just beyond my comprehension. And the gentleman is absolutely right. If you are going to have a gun, please exercise common sense safety and keep those guns away from children, toddlers, young kids, and teach a proper respect for guns. One of the worst cases that I've read about in the last 2 weeks was an 11-year-old boy asked to see the new puppy of the 8-year-old girl who lived near him. And the little girl, for whatever reason, said no, she didn't want him to see her puppy. He went home. He got his father's loaded shotgun. He went back and he killed her. So all I'm asking, I think, is pretty common sense. We need new legislation to close the loopholes, to remove the immunity from liability, to use technology to get instant background checks for real, not just saying it. But ultimately, people have to exercise common sense in dealing with these weapons. And keeping them away from children should be rule number one, in my opinion. So thank you. Thank you. This gentleman right there in the gray T-shirt.
Hi. I love your commitment to clean energy, but I was wondering, do you consider the extraction and use of shale gas to be clean energy? And as president, what kind of regulation would you like to see implemented for the fracking industry and the use of gas?
That's a great question, and it's one I give the Obama administration a lot of credit over the last 2 years in particular. They have been, yes, let's give the Obama administration a lot of credit for their energy and climate change policy. And they've been struggling with this. And they've begun to come out with recommended regulations, like, for example, to control methane emissions. I think you also have to have very tough water standards. And I think from talking to experts in the Obama administration and on the outside, here is what they have convinced me of, and this is the following. There are some places in our country where this extraction technique may be appropriate if we do more research and we figure out how to cut the methane emissions and keep the water clean. There are lots of other places where it is not. And part of what the federal government needs to start doing is drawing some lines and informing states and localities. And we should also never preempt states and localities from saying no. If a local government says no, not here, they should be able to do that. And part of the reason why I think the Obama administration experts have taken this position is we have to go through a transition. We have to move away from fossil fuels, including gas, but that gas can be a useful bridge, especially as we move away from coal and we move away from dirtier oil and some of the really bad alternatives. And we want to keep more fossil fuels under the ocean and in the ground. That's why I'm against Arctic drilling and why I'm against offshore drilling, because I don't think we should start that. So I'm trying to listen to people who I know care a lot about the environment, care a lot about climate change, and are trying to figure out what are the smart steps we can take. So in some instances, I can go along with it. In lots of others, I can't. And we need to be moving as quickly as possible to 100% clean, renewable energy. We have a long way to go, but that should be our goal, and we should do nothing that interferes with or undermines our efforts to reach that goal as soon as it is possible. The lady in green right there, here, this lady right there.
Thank you for taking my question. It actually is a follow-up to that. So southern New Hampshire is actually fighting a frack gas pipeline right now, which I believe that you know about. One of our biggest problems is that it's coming through New Hampshire. It's not for us. We don't need it. It's for export. One of my concerns beyond all of the issues surrounding fracked gas is about FERC, our Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, which is funded by big oil and gas. What will you do to change FERC? Because right now we've had candidates come and tell us it's a local issue. It's not. We have no control. What can you do to help us?
You know, I think you've made a very important point, and I didn't really focus on this until I've been traveling around New Hampshire. And the concerns that residents have expressed about FERC really are legitimate, because the process that FERC is employing does not give enough weight to public opinion in the locations where pipelines are going through. It does not pay, in my opinion, enough attention to all of the other issues, whether they be health issues, safety issues, and the like. And so I am going to do what I can to try to make it absolutely the case that FERC has to, in any of these decisions, pay much more attention to local communities and listen to what your concerns are and do much more to evaluate whatever the consequences or the downsides of these decisions are. Because right now, their mandate seems to be only about delivery of energy at anywhere, anytime. And I don't think that's adequate in today's world. If we're going to have a climate, what? That's not.
That's what we're fighting against.
Yeah, but let's not confuse the two issues. When you say supported, they're not paid for by oil and gas. They are certainly, as a regulator for oil and gas, used to paying attention to what oil and gas industry says. I will absolutely give you that. See, my problem, though, now that people in Hollis and elsewhere have raised this with me, is that if we're going to have a national commitment to do something about climate change, FERC needs to be part of that national commitment. And that's my view on how we have to alter a lot of parts of the federal government. You know, it's not just the EPA that needs to be focused on combating climate change. Every part of the federal government needs to be focused, because I want to have a national goal. And, you know, I've said, look, I want to have, by the end of my first term, 500 million more solar panels installed. And by the end of my second term, enough clean, renewable energy to power every home in America. And if those are our goals, then it's really important that we don't have the right hand doing something different than the left hand in the old saying. So it would be my intention to, if legislative changes, regulatory changes are necessary, to undertake those, but also to appoint people who will be really focused on how everybody works toward this big overarching national goal, and not, you know, have old think. You know, there was a time when we needed more energy. People remember, some of us are able to remember, being in very long gas lines. At least I remember those days. And we were pretty much captive to Middle East oil. So we had a different mindset. But now we've got to change that. So I think your question is not only a specific one about a particular decision, but it raises the larger issue about what we're going to do to change our values, our goals. And that's what I'm going to try to do.
Secretary Clinton. So the national student debt level has reached $1.1 trillion. The average student graduating from a New Hampshire college is going to be approximately $32,000, and quite honestly, I'd be surprised to find a student in this room with that little. What are you going to do to help students graduate college?
Great question. Well, let me ask, how many people in this room currently have student debt? Wow. How many, keep your hands up, how many have ever had student debt? So, I mean, that's a pretty healthy majority here. That's a great question. And your statistics are right. We have 40 million people with student debt that now reaches $1.2 trillion. So the first and most important thing is we need to make it possible for every person with student debt, current and those who have graduated, refinance that debt. You know, that to me is the number one goal. And if you think about it, everybody else can refinance their debt. Corporations can refinance their debt. You can refinance your mortgage. You can refinance your car payment. Why is it students can't refinance their debt? And the worst injustice to me is that we've had practically zero interest rates for 7 years. And yet, I want to ask, how many of you know that you are paying an interest rate of at least 7%? Yeah. I mean, we have people who are paying interest rates far beyond what the real interest rates are. So I want everybody to be able to refinance, and then I want to do much more to get both students and graduates into income contingency repayment plans. Now, what is that? Well, this is what I had when I went to law school. So did my husband. You know, we both borrowed money. We worked, we borrowed money. And in the loans we had, when we graduated, we both were teachers. We taught at the University of Arkansas Law School. My first job was with the Children's Defense Fund and then with the University of Arkansas. So as I recall, making like between $14,000 and $17,000 a year. And we couldn't have paid some big fixed rate based on a high interest rate. So we paid back as a percentage of our income on a monthly basis, and as I recall, it was like 10%. And it took, I don't know, 15 years, but it didn't have the burden that I now hear about from so many young people and their families because of the high fixed rates. And the other thing I'd really like to do more of is to make sure that people who go into what are public service, national service jobs get a lower rate, get more forgiveness faster, get a discount because they are doing something that serves their community. And then to have a date certain when your obligations end. If you've been a responsible payer and you've taken advantage of all the new opportunities that I want to provide, there will be an end point, and you can, count on that. So this is a big deal to me because too many people are being held back because of this debt. And you say 32,000, I think that's one of the highest averages in the country. Students in New Hampshire are bearing. So it's a big problem for everybody, but particularly students here. And I've met a lot of them who, because of their student debt, they can't take jobs they'd like to take because they can't afford them. I met a young woman who said she had the dream job of her life in Boston, but she couldn't afford to pay her student debt and live there. So like so many young people today, she's still living with her parents. And that's nice, but you deserve a chance to kind of get out there and make your own decisions about where you're going to live and where you're going to work and all the rest of it. So that's what I want to do, and I will make that a very high priority. So, okay, what does that say? Oh, you're from Mount Holyoke. A fellow seven sister. Does that mean you wanted to ask a Mount Holyoke question? No, I just wanted to have a question. I thought that might get. Yeah, it did. I know. I could see you writing and holding it up, and I had to get really close to read it. Go ahead.
All right. So my question, I actually have two. That's okay. So you talk about empowering women, and I was wondering if you're going to do anything about human trafficking. And then my second question, which kind of goes along with college and everything else, is how else are you going to empower the youth of America?
Well, with respect to your first question on human trafficking, I feel passionately about this and have worked on this issue since my days as First Lady. In fact, back in 2000, I worked with a coalition of outside activists and members of Congress to pass the first ever United States legislation against human trafficking. Proud to say my husband signed it, so that began our efforts on human trafficking. And I stayed focused on that as senator, and then as Secretary of State, worked really hard to do more about human trafficking around the world and still here at home. We appointed a first-rate federal prosecutor who had prosecuted some of the human trafficking cases in the United States to head the office in the State Department to take on these issues. And we also pressured through the human trafficking annual study different countries to have to change their laws, to enforce their laws. When I, as First Lady, talked with representatives of other countries, they really didn't understand why the United States was making a big deal out of this because it was part of, in their view, the culture. And now they know that they're going to be graded every year by the United States government, and that if they are having a failing grade several years in a row, they can lose aid and other benefits from the United States government. And it's our tool to try to get laws passed, to change enforcement, and actually to go after human trafficking. it remains one of the biggest sources of criminal activity and profits in the world. Sometimes we think of only one or two kinds of human trafficking. You know, the refugees flooding into Europe are in many respects a form of human trafficking. They're picked up by smugglers who often abandon them. The children and adults who come across our southern border are often treated the same way. They are, you know, their families pay money to smugglers and traffickers who, again, may abandon them in the desert, may abandon them to their fate on the long, you know, journey that they are taking. We have a lot of trafficking of people into really exploitative labor situations. Literally, people being kidnapped and put on fishing boats, being chained to sewing machines in factories. And then, of course, we have sex trafficking, where young women in particular, but even children, are preyed upon, and where poor families are convinced to essentially sell their daughters. I remember being in northern Thailand when I was First Lady, and it was before we passed our trafficking statute, and part of the reason I was there was to talk with the government to convince them to take this seriously. And I went to a hospice for young women who were the victims of AIDS after having been trafficked into the brothels in Bangkok, and then when they were ill, thrown literally on the street. Some of them would make their way back to their homes. Their families who'd been paid for them would reject them. And I remember standing by the wheelchair of a dying 12-year-old girl and having the aid workers who were taking care of her tell me her story. And then the aid worker says, you can tell the families that have sold their daughters by driving around these villages, the huts, the houses with satellites have sold their daughters. And so this is such a deep part of discrimination against women and girls, a rejection of their importance, their human dignity, their rights, that it is a deep challenge to change attitudes in many parts of the world about the value of girls, and to make the case that educating a girl over the long run will be far better for the family than selling her at the age of 11 or 12 to be either an indentured servant or a sex worker. So this is an area that is particularly a concern of mine, because it goes hand in hand with the exploitation of poor people, marginalized people, and particularly girls and women in many places across the country. Thank you.
Back to handguns. My name is Gene Wojciechowski. Recently, Australia managed to get away or take away tens of thousands, millions of handguns. And in 1 year, they're all gone. Can we do that? And why, if we can't, why can't we?
You know, Australia is a good example. Canada is a good example. The UK is a good example. Why? Because each of them had mass killings. Australia had a huge mass killing about 20, 25 years ago. Canada did as well. So did the UK. And in by offering to buy back those guns, they were able to, you know, curtail the supply and to set a different standard for gun purchases in the future. Now, communities have done that in our country. Several communities have done gun buyback programs, but I think it would be worth considering doing it on the national level if that could be arranged. Remember, I know after the terrible 2008 financial crisis, I think one of the programs that President Obama was able to get in place was cash for clunkers. Remember that? You know, getting them off the road. And It was partly a way to get people to buy new cars because we wanted more economic activity, and it was partly a way to get old models that were polluting too much sort of off the road. So I think that's worth considering. I don't know enough details to tell you how we would do it or how it would work, but certainly the Australian example is worth looking at. Thank you for raising that. Yeah, right there. Here comes a microphone.
Thank you. My name's Nicole, and I would just like to thank you for coming to Keene State today. I'm studying to be a teacher here, and so I was wondering what your thoughts are on education reform and what you plan on doing for education reform once you become president.
Well, I'm glad you're going to be a teacher.
Thank you.
And I have to say, Keene State has a well-deserved reputation for turning out educators. And I want to really, applaud Keene State faculty and students. Well, I could talk about this a long time, but I'll try to be more focused. First of all, I think we have to do more to actually pay attention to what educators tell us about what will work in the classroom. And that sounds so obvious that some of you are probably wondering, why would you say something so obvious? Well, because we've been having a very vigorous debate, a contentious debate over what will work and what won't work to try to increase educational achievement among our young people. And I think the debate has gotten off base. I think it's too much about the latest fads, the latest products, the latest models, instead of taking a deep breath and actually talking to experts who have done an enormous amount of research about what really works. I want to get back to looking at what really works. And I know that there are a lot of well-meaning people who are really down on the public schools, and I just don't believe or share that. I think the public schools are one of the bedrock institutions of our democracy, and therefore, we need to do more to make them work. And so here are a couple of observations, because this is a much longer conversation, and I must say I am honored to have the support of the teachers of New Hampshire and America in my campaign. And because of that, I want to be a partner in figuring out what are the best ways forward to do a better job helping kids, particularly poor kids, particularly kids with special needs, particularly kids who come into school from literally the first day of kindergarten, not as prepared as their classmates are to be successful. So I start with early childhood education and universal pre-kindergarten. That's where I start. And I think it's a grave disservice to ignore the fact that the first 5 years of life set up a child, set up the vocabulary of that child. We now know from brain research even influences the brain in ways that will make it easier or less so in learning. The brain research tells us that 80% of your brain is physically formed by the age of 3. So what happens in those first 3 years and then those first 5 years before you ever go into a formal classroom really depends on the family and the community and what kinds of support families can be given. I am a strong believer in early education, particularly for kids that have various kinds of disadvantages. And I'll just tell you a quick story. When Bill was governor of Arkansas, one of our problems was it was, the second poorest state in America. And our teachers were the second poorest paid in America. And a lot of our families had really serious economic challenges. And so when you're thinking about, okay, what do you do to try to improve the schools, we tackled standards, we raised teacher pay, we did a lot that needed to be done that was overdue. But we also looked at this problem about what happens when kids show up that first day. And as a result, I began looking all over to try to find an affordable program that could help more low-income kids be better prepared. Because a lot of programs that are the real state-of-the-art are expensive. Now, I would love for our country to invest in them because you actually save money at the end of it. That's been proven over and over again. But being realistic, we got to find everything we can do and try to make it affordable. So this was so serendipitous. I was in Florida with Bill. We were attending some meeting that he had, and I was just literally in the hotel room flipping through the paper, and I saw a picture of a professor from Israel who was giving a lecture about a program they'd started there. And I read about it, and it was fascinating because it basically said that after a big influx of immigrants from poor nations like Ethiopia, the kids would go to the excellent Israeli schools, but they weren't achieving. And so the Israeli researchers at Hebrew University were saying, well, wait, what's going on here? They're in the schools. If the schools were the only answer, why aren't they doing better? And then they realized that they had to work in the family in those first 5 years. So I called this woman. Her name was Avima Lombard. And I said, Dr. Lombard, I'm Hillary Clinton. I'm calling you from Arkansas. She goes, where? And I said, Arkansas. She goes, where's that? I said, well, it's sort of next to Texas. Oh, okay. Look on a map. And I asked her if she were coming to the United States, because I would like to meet with her to figure out whether what they did in Israel was transferable to a place like Arkansas. She came. And we began what's called the Home Instruction Program for Preschool Youngsters. And basically, the idea behind it was to help the mother become her child's first teacher, to feel confident and competent enough to try to prepare her own child to learn, doing very simple things like talking to her baby. A lot of low-income mothers, when I started doing this back in the 80s, I would say, I bet you're loving talking to your baby. And they'd say, well, why would I talk to her? She can't talk back. Not because she didn't love her baby, but because she had no idea. That's how you built brain cells and synapses and vocabulary. So fast forward, this program has now been going on across the country for 25 years, and it has a great track record. So we can do more in the homes, helping parents be their child's first teachers, but we still need universal pre-kindergarten so that every child can get that level of preparation so that when they go to that first day of kindergarten, they have a fighting chance to be successful. So there's a lot I want to do, but I'll end there by saying that I am really looking forward to working with the teachers and parents of America to make our education system everything it should be. Thanks. Okay, back here.
Thank you, Mrs. Clinton. I know a couple of weeks back, you came and spoke to a large group about the drug issue in our state. And we are grandparents raising our 10-year-old grandson because his father, we lost him to an overdose. And I love Keene State because I taught here for 15 years, retired from here. Would you please just say a bit more, even though you're probably preaching to the choir?
Well, I have to say, Gladys, that you are the third grandmother that I have personally met in New Hampshire in the last several months who's raising a grandchild because of drugs. We did have an incredible town hall here, didn't we, Molly? 600-700 people, most of them really affected in some way or another by this terrible epidemic of addiction, and in particular here in New Hampshire and next door in Vermont, heroin. And the heroin epidemic, which is killing so many young people and leaving grieving and broken families behind. I don't think I would have been talking about this issue had I not spent several months listening to people. And in Iowa on my first trip in this campaign, and then in New Hampshire in Keene on my first trip. I was with Joanne and some others. I heard about the heroin epidemic. And so I began looking into it. And I know that everywhere I went, somebody raised it with me, sometimes publicly, sometimes afterwards privately. So that's why I have a comprehensive agenda to try to begin to reverse this tide of addiction. It includes better preventive efforts. It includes more treatment, something that we just don't have enough of. If you do have somebody and you persuade them to seek treatment, only 1 in 10 will get it in a timely way because we don't have enough of it. We also are seeing real progress. In Laconia, I had a meeting about this issue, and I was so impressed by the police chief who has changed the whole way he polices drug abuse and drug offenses. Instead of sending people to jail, they are trying to get people into treatment. They're trying to match them with some kind of, mentor from the recovery community. And they are now equipped with the antidote to reverse heroin overdoses, Naxalone, known as Narcan. So we have to change the way we police. We need far more.
We'll break away here. The U.S. House is gaveling briefly for.
That it would be a terrible mistake for the industry to be able to use their influence in Congress to stop states from doing exactly as you said, looking into it, finding out more about it. And I want more research too, because I think you're right. There are some forms of this that are lifesavers. Drought-resistant crops are often genetically modified. And we don't want to deprive people in drought conditions from being able to grow crops that they then can use unless there is evidence, research that shows they shouldn't do it. But on the other hand, we need an ongoing system of doing much more to check out all the chemicals and genetic changes. And it's not just GMOs I'm worried about. We have hundreds, if not thousands, of chemicals that we have never tested to determine what their real impact is, or in concert with other elements or other chemicals. So I'm a huge believer in safety and in the right to know. And I think we are not doing enough on either of those counts. So right now, that's where I stand on it. I am not in any way pro, just forward, no questions asked. I think that's not smart. But I'm also not anti, no questions asked. There's no possible use for these kinds of altered crops, which we've been eating, as you know, for hundreds of years in different forms. It's just much more sophisticated now. But I am very much in favor of making sure it's labeled, making sure that no state or local community is stopped from doing what it thinks is right, and much more money by independent sources in looking at the impact so we have that better information in the first place. Okay. Oh, yes. I hate to not let somebody else ask a question back here who's had my back. I've had my back to them the whole time. How about this young lady in the Keene State debate? I'm big on debates, so. All right, wait, I'll give you just a minute. Here you go.
Thank you. So I'm a senior at Keene State, and I'm majoring in Holocaust and Genocide Studies. And my amazing professors and classmates and I are wondering what your plans are for genocide and mass atrocity awareness and prevention, and specifically what the plans for the Atrocity Prevention Board would look like. Thank you.
Well, I have to say, I think, and maybe somebody can correct me if I'm wrong, I think Keene State may be the first college in the country to have a Holocaust Genocide Studies program, right? And I join in the applause. I think that's absolutely amazing and brilliant to have a specific curriculum to look at Holocaust studies and genocide, because we've got to have educated young people and others like you who are equipped to help us deal with a lot of these issues because unfortunately we are, living with them, and we have to come up with, a better response. I was privileged to announce the Atrocities Prevention Board when it was first set up in the Obama administration. And I did it at the Holocaust Museum in Washington. If any of you have been there, it was the most appropriate, perfect place to make that announcement. And I will certainly not only continue it, but look for ways that its visibility can become higher so that more people know that the United States has this board, and that we will work to find ways to try to bring people together around some common responses to the potential for genocide, learning from the past. And there are so many both kind of theoretical and practical aspects to this that deserve a lot of thought. For example, we know that oftentimes in conflicts, ethnic, religious, tribal, other leaders of groups actually set these genocides or ethnic cleansing in motion. They use the media. We saw that in Bosnia, where people who had lived together peacefully for a very long time were set against each other through a propaganda effort on the media that turned neighbor against neighbor and even split families. So we have to understand quickly, if something like that is happening, what are the best ways to try to combat it? We saw the same thing in Rwanda. We have seen the same thing in the Central African Republic between Christians and Muslims and their political battles. So we have to not only condemn this and speak out against the horrible effects of the Holocaust, of genocide, of atrocities, but we have to really analyze it. And that's why I'm so proud of the course you're doing. Like, what triggers it? What turns people against one another who have been maybe not loving each other, but not killing each other, and then all of a sudden something sets them off? And how do we try to have interventions that prevent that? And a lot of cultures are on a tripwire. Something can set them off. So how do we help other countries with the huge variety of cultures in the world understand what they need to do to try to prevent it from escalating? So I'm delighted, and I hope that those who are in this program and graduate from it will find, ways in our government, ways in international organization, in not-for-profits, to be really actively involved in helping us understand what to do to prevent this from happening in the future. So, lady right there, yeah, right there, yep. I guess somebody, yeah, do we have a mic? Here comes a microphone. Yeah. yeah. A little more difficult to get through there. Here it comes.
Thank you for taking my question. Glass-Steagall protected the American people and the American economy for decades, and then it was dismantled, and we crashed and hit bottom. At the debate, you said you would not be in support of reinstating Glass-Steagall. I'm wondering why, and also if you become president, how would you protect us from rogue banks and Wall Street?
Well, I intend to do just that, and my plan is more comprehensive, more effective, and in fact tougher. And take a look at Paul Krugman's column today. Paul Krugman, who I think has pretty amazing progressive credentials, right? Basically said that I had the better side of this argument. Now, why did he say this? Because I fully respect my colleagues who have said, let's reinstate Glass-Steagall. And if I thought that alone would prevent the potential next crisis, I'd raise my hand and join. But that's not my assessment. Because if you look, as Krugman said today in his column, some of the major actors who caused the '08 crash were not big banks. They would have never been covered by Glass-Steagall. AIG, the giant insurance company, Lehman Brothers, they would never have been affected by it. And what I want to do is to crack down on the banks by assessing a risk fee and forcing them to have to comply with Dodd-Frank and tougher regulations. And I am absolutely in favor of breaking them up if they become a risk to the economy. But the potential next threat to our economy that has to really be reined in is what's called the shadow banking world, the hedge funds, the money market funds. Glass-Steagall wouldn't do anything about that if it were reinstated tomorrow. So I have the greatest respect for my colleagues and former colleagues who are really focused on that. But I go further than that. My proposal, which you can go to my website and read about, goes much further and includes everybody that I think would pose a risk to the economy, including the big banks, but going much further than that. So that's why I've taken the position I have. And you can read Paul Krugman today to understand why. Okay. Okay, this young man, I think, has had his hand up for a long time, and he's got a cheering section behind him. He's brought his own cheerleaders who are...
Thank you.
Yes, go right ahead.
As a bisexual member of the LGBT community, equal rights has been a very important thing to me. You said that over the years, your views on this topic have evolved. How do you compare yourself to other candidates that have remained firm on their views, and how do you think you've done to change from your past views?
Well, I think that if you speak with the Human Rights Campaign or any of the large advocacy groups, they will tell you that they count on me and that you can count on me. I was, I think, the first and only First Lady ever to march in a gay pride parade back in the late 1990s. So I have been an advocate, a vocal, visible advocate for equality and against discrimination. Yes, my views did evolve, and I think most people my age would say the same thing. There might be some exceptions, but largely because of my strong opposition to discrimination of any sort and my personal relationships with a lot of people over the years, I certainly concluded that marriage equality should be the law of the land, and I was thrilled when the Supreme Court made it the law of the land, and I will... I will enforce marriage equality, but we've got to go further than that. You know, in a lot of states now, because of the constitutional decision, you can get married on Saturday and get fired on Monday because we still permit discrimination in employment and in public accommodations. So we have to pass the Equality Act, which is currently pending in Congress. That will be my highest priority, so that marriage isn't the end of the debate. It's a step along the path to true equality, and you will be able to count on me to fight for you. Okay, up there. Yes, okay, here you go. I love your red.
So I've been a nurse for 25 years in a long-term care setting, and we're faced with a lot of challenges that I'm sure many people have experienced, from Medicare cuts to drug companies that gouge people. We recently had an individual that was being charged $20-something thousand for 7 days of medication, which is just not something people have. But in a bigger scheme right now is the nursing shortage that is plaguing the country, and it's going to gain momentum as baby boomers retire. And New Hampshire's experiencing it, the long-term care industry is experiencing, as is the hospital. do you have any thoughts on what we can do? Because when we're looking at standards of care and quality and the things that we want for our loved ones, but yet then people going into the industry are challenged between their workload, how do we manage that, and how do we make it possible to raise the number of nurses out there serving our community?
Well, first of all, thanks for being a nurse. And I think people know or should know that nursing care is often the single biggest reason people either get well and recover or not. So the nurse is at the center of the healthcare system in many ways. So a couple of things about this. One, the last time I looked, most nursing programs were oversubscribed by people wanting to get into them. There were far more applicants than there were places for them. So I think we should be expanding our training programs, our educational programs, so that we can actually train more nurses, so we can get ahead of what is a very serious problem with the retirement of a lot of baby boom nurses. And the fact that we're just not going to have enough of a supply if we don't start trying to fill the pipeline now. So there are some excellent programs, but we're going to have to open additional excellent programs, and we're going to have to try to support, and I would be in favor of federal support for programs that have a proven track record of turning out excellent nurses so that they can expand more faculty, more slots, so that they can add to the numbers who can get into the profession early. I also think it's important that nurses be given more authority in the medical settings in which they work. We know that a lot of nurses are being overworked. They're being asked to serve very long shifts, and a lot of them now, because the numbers have shrunk in a lot of settings, particularly hospital settings, and I think nursing home settings as well. Nurses are responsible for many more patients. And the nurses with whom I have spoken have all said, this is unsustainable. Because if you've ever shadowed a nurse, which I did back in 2007, it's exhausting. You know, in and out of patients' rooms. I was in a hospital, stopping to do the checking with doctors, filling out the forms. You know, by the end of the shift, you're just drained. And if you're trying to take care of too many patients, the result can be, you know, unfortunate because we're not setting up our systems to get the best possible care. So I think on both ends, more training, more education, more support for those programs, and try to make sure that nurses on the job have the support and the authority that they need. That's how I would try to approach this. Oh, one more question. Well, Mike, there's a lot of hands up here, Mike, so I'm going to let you pick whoever it is, since you're the one. Who did you pick with your eyes shut? Okay, all right.
Bring us back to student loans. I am a senior here at Keene State in the elementary education department. And the last 3 years, all of my loans have been through a credit card company because my parents make too much money. And my FAFSA said, oh, well, your expected parent income to help me is $30,000 a year. Well, they don't have $30,000 a year to give me towards my education. So I have extremely high interest rates, and the only way I now have any federal support for this year is because I got married last summer. So I just find it mind-blowing that I'm still the same person who's been with the same partner for almost 6 years, and I've had the same parents with the same jobs and the same income and the same financial situation, but now the government says, hey, now we can help you because you got married. And before that, I wasn't worth any federal help. I had to go through credit card companies.
Yeah, I can't stand that. I think that's terrible. And so we are going to change that. I think that FAFSA application is absurd. I mean, it is just absolutely absurd. And so I think, you know, we've had a kind of perfect storm. The application turns people off, and it penalizes people like your parents. So it's a lose-lose, no matter where you start from. The Parents Plus loans, I don't know if any of you have those, have become so expensive and way beyond the means of most families to be able to manage. The federal government should not be making a profit off of student loans. That is my strong belief. So we got to fix the whole system. And your example is unfortunately all too common. Like, you're the same person. If families can make a contribution, fine, but it has to be reasonable. If students can work, I worked, so maybe I'm a little biased, 10 hours a week to be able to get debt-free tuition, which is my goal. Debt-free tuition. You never have to borrow a penny to pay tuition for public college or university like Keene State. So that will cut your costs. And it's just generally become, so wrong. I had a young woman, I think in Nevada, say to me, the hardest part about going to college shouldn't be figuring out how to pay for it. And the amount of stress and anguish and disappointment from young people and their families is just beyond anything it should ever be. And the other problem, which I've encountered back and forth in talking to people about all of this, is that a lot of young people who try to start and then something happens and they drop out, they are stuck with the loans and they don't have anything to show for it because they never got their degree. And the worst offenders are some, not all, I want to make that very clear, some of the not-for-profit college or the for-profit colleges that are pretty unscrupulous in how they treat students and their parents. And one of the most exploited groups are our veterans who, under the new GI Bill, have the opportunity to get an education. And a lot of these for-profit colleges try to recruit the vets, and then they basically take the money under one of the loopholes in the law and don't produce the results for our vets. So there are a number of issues here that I'm going to be confronting, and the debt-free tuition would be a big help to you. That's going to be one of my primary goals, to make college more affordable and to get the debt load down and hopefully eliminated in a more reasonable way than what you're facing. Thank you all very much.